Good morning and welcome to Gwangchigi beach on Jeju Island. Right now I'm walking down to the rocks at the edge of the beach here that usually make for a good foreground, and the tide is quite high today, so there aren't a lot of rocks exposed, especially the ones closer to the peak itself. So let's spin this around for a moment. What I'm basically doing is walking along the beach looking for these rock formations that might make for an interesting foreground. And again, we've got that bank of clouds along the horizon here that's so common on this island. But we do have a couple of sort of high trailing clouds above that hopefully will catch a little bit of light. And with the wide angle lens, I should be able to accentuate and try to make for some interesting compositions. But what I'm basically trying to do right now is to find a foreground that I can emphasize with that wide angle lens. By getting down low, being very close to that foreground, I can make it a lot bigger. And so with a sky that's so uninteresting like this, one of the things that we can try and do is to try and find a very interesting foreground to emphasize. So I'm going to head just over here, see if I can find something on these rocks. Okay, so I've done a bit of walking around on the rocks here, and I found this composition that I think might work. I'm going to get out the 12mm and take a look at it through the lens. But for now, what I'm thinking is in the bottom right-hand corner, I'll have the rocks that I'm standing on here, and then I've got these couple of rocks that are dotted out in the water here, along with this shelf that's slowly being exposed as the tide sort of rolls over it. And then I have that nice peak in the background and a cloud sort of running over the top of it that I hope will get longer as the morning goes on. So I'm going to grab the camera out, put it on the tripod, and see if I can get this composition to work. Okay, so I've got the composition and I think it works pretty well. I've got up a little higher than I thought I would just to be able to separate these rocks with the peak in the background there. And because the sun is sort of rising basically directly opposite me, what I'm getting is a lot of glare off that water. So I'm going to take out the M7 kit, put in a polarizer, and then I want to put it in an ND to slightly blur the water or to smooth it out a little bit. The only ND that I have that will fit on top of the polarizer is a 10-stop, so we're probably going to deal with a very long exposure. And then I'm going to probably add a 3-stop grad just to bring that sky down a little bit, because I feel like I want to keep some detail in the unlit side of the rocks here so that I can sort of pull that out when I'm getting back and working on it in post. So let's take a look at how that turns out. Okay, so the sun has already risen and nothing really eventuated from it. I've got just dozens of people along the beach here. Found a bit of a composition that I might be able to make work, but it's full of tripods and people watching the sunrise at the moment. So what I'm hoping is that in about 2 or 3 minutes, when they realize this isn't going to eventuate, everybody will leave and go back for breakfast, and hopefully I'll be able to get a clean shot of that, just sort of focusing on this foreground. And then I should be able to move around a little bit as well, because right now I'll show you what's happening here. You know, basically dotted along this beach, we've got just people and tripods and people with phones just basically watching this happen. And so it's really, really difficult to get a clear shot, especially with a wide angle lens. So once they all realize this isn't going to happen and get tired of the cold a little bit, they'll all go back for breakfast and a cup of coffee. So hopefully I'll be able to get a shot, because that sun's not coming up anytime soon, so it should stay pretty similar to this. Okay, so I was wrong. Everybody seems to have foregone coffee and decided to stick around in the hopes that something might eventuate. Now, I've decided also that maybe I will stick around for this. The sun should crest those clouds in about 5 minutes time, and what I'm hoping is, you see all these moss-covered rocks in the foreground here, that hopefully they'll just start to get side-lit by the rising sun as they are sort of sloped towards it. So hopefully we'll get some interesting contrast and maybe a bit of light on the peak in the background as well. Okay, so what a morning. The moment the sun came up, the clouds started to move, and the ones that were sitting across the horizon just there, just waiting patiently for the last hour or so, have just started to move and covered the sun. So we're not going to get that beautiful side light here. I think I'm going to walk around and just try to get a few more graphic compositions, and then we'll be done with this, and I'm going to head in and have a cup of coffee as well. So I'll be back here in a couple of days. So not a total failure, but I was hoping for something a little bit nicer this morning. This section is from my first morning on Jeju, and I am down at Yongduam, the Dragon's Head Rock, right next to the airport. Now, this is a very commonly frequented location. It's pretty much on every single visitor to the island's itinerary at one point or another. It's very easily accessible, and so I wanted to get down there and just get a shot as I began my journey around the island. And this first image here actually had me in a fairly precarious spot. So the tripod was balanced on some relatively slippery rocks, and everything underfoot was a little bit unsteady and very, very slippery. And so I decided that rather than risk slipping and breaking something on the very first day, that I would film it and do a little voiceover later on. So it actually ended up being one of my favorite shots of the morning, so I do want to include it in this video. In terms of composition, I'm using the Samyang 12mm f2 to take in the whole scene. So by moving around to the left of the bay, not only do I get a clear view of the Dragon's Head rock itself, but with a lens this wide I can actually take in the full sweep of the bay. And so my main goals were to use some darker areas at the bottom of the frame to sort of fence you in and force you to look up at that main subject, and also not to allow the foreground to become sort of the dominant aspect of this frame. So with a wide-angle lens, it can be very easy to go looking for a foreground, get really close to it, and really accentuate it, get a little bit excited about how it can make foreground elements look, and then have that foreground element actually end up taking away from the subject itself. And so what I wanted to do was strike that balance where the foreground rocks were just simply a supporting element. They didn't have a lot of detail in them. They weren't taking up a third or two-thirds of the frame and just sort of really taking you away from what I want you to look at. So the way to do that is basically to find a tripod location where I can have rocks on the left and right in the bottom corners, and then also choose the right tripod height, because as I get lower, I get closer to those rocks, they get a little bit bigger, and they start to become a little bit domineering. But as you raise the tripod up, they get a little bit smaller and just become more of a supporting element. In terms of filter choice, I am actually working pre-sunrise, so you could probably get a reasonably long exposure without filters, but I really wanted that water to turn completely milky and just have the rocks and that the Dragon's Head rock actually be the things that you focus on rather than texture in the water. I chose to use my drop-in 6-stop filter for the Haida M7 kit, and the reason that I used a 6-stop filter is because, well, that's the weakest one that I have. If I had a 3 or a 4-stop filter, I could have got myself a 15 or a 30 second exposure quite easily, and that would have been enough in the pre-dawn light. But 6-stop filter being the one that I had, that's the one I decided to use. And I also ended up using a 3-stop graduated filter to bring down that sky a little bit. Now, I have a soft edge graduated filter and a medium edge graduated filter for this kit, and I chose the soft edge one here because if you have that horizon line, which is quite sharp, and then you have things jutting up from it, if you end up using a medium edge or a hard edge filter, you can get a very harsh line running across the frame that's a little bit too obvious. And so the soft edge filter allows me to sort of feather the edge of what the filter is doing there, and not really cause any extreme dark areas inside the mountain on the right or the Dragon's Head rock itself. Just allows me to sort of feather the light across that while still bringing the top of the sky down and sort of forcing you again to stay within the frame. So let's take a look at that. One of the great things about working with a wide-angle lens is just how many different takes on a scene you can get by just moving a couple of meters. So I moved a couple of meters to my right, and now I've got this sort of mossy rock garden in the foreground here. And I've decided to put the camera quite high for this one, just so that I can see all of those rocks. If I get down too low, you lose the ocean in the middle. So if we take a look at that now, sort of, you lose that ocean in the middle there. You get all those beautiful rocks, but you sort of lose that ocean. When you come back up, you get the ocean back again. Okay, so I found this composition quite a bit further up the coast, and I'm going to try and shoot this in two ways. And the first one is a 65 by 24 panorama on the GFX, and since I have the 45 to 100, my frame is going to get cut off around about here and just at the end of the islands, and it will sort of be this long slither just here. So what you'll have is the clouds coming off the peak of the mountain here, leading you down to these islands, which will hopefully lead you back along here, and we should have a reasonably interesting composition where both points basically end at these two brother islands over here. Hopefully we'll get a little bit of light once the sun peaks above the clouds, but before that I do have this nice glow on these rocks here, and so what I'm going to do is get out the X-T4 with the Samyang 12mm and get as close to this frame that you can see with the GoPro here as possible. I've got a 2-second timer here just to make sure I don't knock the camera. There's a little bit of wind blowing, but it's not too bad at the moment. This combination of filters, having the 6-stop to lengthen the exposure and then the 3-stop soft grad to bring the sky down a little bit, gives me the shutter speed of 4 seconds, which with the water not moving too fast at the moment, gives me a nice bit of texture in the top of it. So I'm just waiting for each wave to come in here, and then as it strikes, the water sort of turns into the whitewash and then comes back and forth a little bit, giving me a little bit of texture. Since this is a video about wide-angle composition, I thought we'd take a little bit of a look at the composition and what went into making it happen. So, as you can see from this height, I've got this sort of arch of rocks going around here. We've got a little bit of whitewash on the left-hand side there, and then I've got the background, which is basically the two mountains and the islands off to the side there. And what will happen with this composition is that we get this sort of empty space over here that's not really contributing a whole lot to it. And so the lower we get, the smaller that space gets. And while it's still quite a large open space, I feel like down here is much, much better than up here. And so what I'm doing now is basically moving back and forth to see if I can include, if I go down low and then I move back just a little bit, you can see that these rocks will actually start to cover up the water in the middle there, even though you can probably see my tripod in the middle there. And that allows us to make that less of a dead space in the composition. So basically I'm going to move back and forth and see what I can find with that. I just spent a couple of minutes moving back and forth trying to see if I could use those rocks as a foreground to cover up a bit of that dead space, but it didn't really work out. It ended up just being sort of black mess in the foreground there. The rocks are a little bit too dark. They didn't have a lot of detail in them. The light wasn't really getting them the way that I thought it might. And so what I've decided to do is move around just about, maybe 5 meters around to the left here. And with wide-angle lenses, as you start to move around things, they dramatically sort of start to change shape. So things start to point at each other, and things in the corners get a little bit more stretched out, and things, you get these diagonal lines that start to be a little bit more prominent. And so just by moving around, I've been able to use the rocks that were on the left-hand side of my frame before on the right-hand side of my frame and have those curve in. And basically a similar composition where we've got the line pointing out to the islands, but now I've got the rocks that were in my background hitting my foreground. And it doesn't really solve so much of the dead space, but it does give a different compositional line here. Now, ideally, let me show you this actually. Ideally, I would like to get down onto those rocks and be able to use them as a really strong, large foreground, but they are quite slippery, and I'm not really wearing the right kind of shoes to be going down there, and I do not want to end up in the drink with my X-T4. So we're up here basically shooting a composition that looks a little bit like this. So the whitewash is going to take up a little bit more of the frame. We're still looking up towards those islands, and we still have that beautiful light hitting the rocks. So let's take a look at that. Okay, welcome back to Seongsan Sunrise Peak. This is my last day on Jeju, and I've definitely been given durians again. We've got a huge bank of clouds that wasn't on the forecast that's come in, and it's just sort of that grey slate cloud. There's nothing interesting about it. It's not storm clouds or anything like that. We've also got the pollution that was here yesterday still in the air, so we can't see very far. And the tide is in, so none of the rocks and rock pools are actually visible here. So again, I'm going to try and make the best of a situation that's not ideal, and basically walk along this beach, finding a couple of the exposed rocks if I can. Seems like the tide is still coming in. Actually, rocks are still disappearing as I walk along here. And then what I'm going to do is aim to do an extremely long exposure, really smooth out that water, really smooth out that sky, hopefully get a little bit of texture in each to show you that they are different things, and work with the line of the shore here to create just a very sort of dark, moody, abstract sort of a shot. Okay, so I've found my place here, and my composition basically just has the big curve of the shoreline coming in the foreground and a couple of rocks out in the water here just to add a little bit of interest. There's really not much around, so I think I'm going to rely on that to basically pull the image through, and I'll probably have to move myself a little bit as the tide keeps coming in. And this is one of the times that I really love to have a filter kit. So with the Haida M7, which fits in this tiny little bag here, I'm able to basically take a fairly simple scene that starts out looking a little bit like this, and then I can add some filters in. I can make a longer exposure to really smooth out that water. I can add a graduated filter to bring that sky down so it's not such a bright part of the image, and just give it a little bit more mood. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this meandering wander across Jeju Island with me. Please do stick around for a few of the other photos from the trip in the slideshow at the end of the video, and as always, thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up on this video and a subscription to the channel. Cheers!